Hello and welcome back to the Road to 2000s. As always, my name is Caleb Denby and I'm your driver on this journey. Today it's going to be a fun one. I wanted to take a look at an opening that I like a lot. It might be my favorite opening in chess. It's one I've had pretty good success with, and it's one I hope I can share the success with you. That opening is the King's Indian Defense from the white side. I wanted to show you some games that I took inspiration from in my opening repertoire, and hopefully go over a lot of the main ideas in this opening. Hopefully by the end you guys will all be masters at it and can crush the King's Indian, because it's a very fun opening to play with both sides. This first game I wanted to take a look at is a game between Wesley So and Liren. They played this I think a couple years ago now, and it is I think one of the most topical lines in the main line of the classical King's Indian. For a long time, people played this opening, a certain way, and then eventually they were like, "Wow, this isn't really working. I keep getting checkmated as white." And then a few years back, they came up with this pawn sacrifice line that I wanted to go over, and this is the line that I use, and this is the line that's good enough for Wesley So it's good enough for me. So let's take a look. The King's Indian, of course, starts after d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3. Bishop g7, e4, d6. Of course, in this position, black can play d5, and that's a Grunfeld. After bishop g7, he's really committing to this King's Indian defense setup. And that's why I play e4 here as white, to take away this option of ever playing d5. As such, black then opts for a more dark square strategy by playing d6, conceding the d5 square, and playing for these dark squares instead. It's a common idea. Knight f3, castles, bishop e2. So this is the classical way of playing the King's Indian defense as white. You develop your knights to the classical squares, you push your pawns to the classical squares, you develop your bishop, you castle your king, everything kind of done classically. I don't know if that's where the name comes from, but it's kind of your standard chess. You do everything you want to do in the opening, you just develop your pieces, control the center. Meanwhile, black plays e5, which is, at first glance, a counterintuitive move, blocking off your own bishop. But like I said, black is really playing for the dark squares in this opening. As white, you don't really want to flinch just yet and do anything in the center. A common line is to actually take on e5, which is leading to an endgame, which has been tried for an advantage for white. But it's not my favorite, and I think black has totally fine chances. As such, the classical line continues with kingside castles. And in this first game, I want to look at knight c6. This is move 7, and this is where I'll kind of be branching off today. So this is kind of our starting point for today. Black has done the King's Indian setup, put his bishop on g7, his knight on f6, and this d6, e5 moves. These are these pawn moves. And from here, black's going to decide how he really wants to play this game. The main line is the line we're looking at in this game, which happens after knight c6, really hammering home this idea of attacking the d4 square. The other two options I'm going to take a look at come after knight to a6, kind of counterintuitive move, but the knight is aiming at some key squares, such as b4 and c5, or knight b to d7. This is the other move I'm going to look at today, also aiming for this c5 square. In this game, though, Liren played the classical move, knight to c6. And of course, now white does have to make a decision about this pawn. He can try to defend it one more time. He can now decide to take on e5, or he can push this pawn. These are all viable options, but the one I'm going to go over today is pawn to d5. This is my pick, and this is kind of the most critical line. Of course, this knight has to move, so the knight comes back to e7. And now, once again, white has quite a few options, and the move I'm picking to look at is knight to e1. So for a long time, this was the way to play as white in the King's Indian. Obviously, there are a ton of different things you can do, but this is one of the most popular lines at the top level, and it still is one of the most popular lines today. Are you guys at all familiar with this position? Have you guys seen this before? Yeah?
Because and against the King's Indian, if he gets in f5 before you get in f4, you're probably worse.
Not necessarily. We're going to take a look at this today, where black actually gets everything he wants on the king's side, But the point is, white gets everything that he wants on the queen's side. And it's kind of this style of race that characterizes this position. So what do I mean? Let me explain a little bit more. So you've probably been told to play on the side where you have more space. And that definitely rings true here. In this case, black has more space on the king's side. You can tell this because this is the direction that his pawns point. So what is black going to do? He's going to expand further on the king's side. Ken, you mentioned that this pawn will come forward to f5 and possibly to f4. And this is something that white has to worry about. As black launching this pawn forward. And actually, we'll see later on in the game, black actually launches the rest of these pawns forward too. And so with that in mind, black gains all this space with his pawns, gets right up next to the white king, and then tries to go for checkmate. So this is why this line is so fun, is if you're the white player, well, if you're the black player, it's fun because you get to checkmate white a lot. But if you're the white player, it's fun because while black is having all this fun on the king's side, you get to have just as much fun on the queen's side. So this is really, I think, the most stark example in chess of the players kind of playing on opposite sides of the board and truly just ignoring each other for as long as possible, which makes it fun. It's like a race to be checkmated or to win on the queen's side. So that's going to be the theme of the game. That's going to be the theme of a lot of positions we look at today, is black playing on the king's side and white trying to play on the queen's side. So continuing on here, knight to d7. This move makes a lot of sense. 1, he's preparing to launch this f-pawn forward, and 2, this pawn is controlling a key square in the black camp. While black is playing for f5, f4, white is usually playing for something involving, these dark squares, getting this pawn to c5. White simply develops his bishop, controlling these key squares. Black launches the pawn forward. White needs to play f3 to defend this pawn and give his bishop space. And black plays naturally with f4. And our bishop's attacked, so bishop f2. g5, very natural for black. And this is all technically theory, but it's not actually that much theory to have to learn to play this opening. It's all very linear, meaning there's not a lot of branching paths, because you really just want to play on the king's side if you're black, and you need to make these defensive moves for white, and then you just launch your attack on the queen's side. So g5 is the next move for black to continue. And here is where, once again, there are a few branching paths for white. So it's kind of tough as the black player in this instance, because white has so many different ways to kind of play. But here, I'm going to recommend the most popular move, rook to c1. This is what Wesley So played in this game, and I think it's the most interesting line. So after knight to g6, this is where things start getting interesting. So for a long time, players wanted to play moves like knight d3 instead of rook to c1, and kind of play this the slow way. Defend this c5 square, then push the pawn forward, then try to open it up. But this is actually a very, very interesting line here if white plays pawn to c5 immediately. So this move doesn't look like it makes too much sense right away, right? Black can just capture this pawn. But what do you think white's idea is here? And this is the main line. This is the way black should play. Yeah, Ken?
I'm not sure if this is the exact order you would do it. If you go bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, knight to b5.
Yeah, so you're on the right track, right? You're looking for ways to rip open this side of the board.
But I wondered, you just move the knight first.
Just move the knight to b5 first? Yeah. That's also a possibility here. So your knee-jerk reaction was to capture, which is good. You should look at those moves first. And after pawn takes, you wanted to play something like knight b5, trying to, open up some attack, get these pieces in the game. And while this is interesting, I don't think it's quite working here just yet.
Because a6.
Yeah, something like a6 actually looks quite good. You don't really want to bring the knight all the way back here. You'd rather have this, attacking option with the rook. But maybe just something like b6, maybe even b5, maybe even something like, I don't know, c6. These all seem kind of possible for black.
And the white knight looks silly.
Yeah, the white knight does look silly, but really the key feature here is white is really missing this bishop. This bishop's a really nice defender of the king side, and it can really attack a lot of squares long distance. And so it's a pretty big commitment to give up this guy. You want to be sure you're getting really something good for it. So it's actually not to capture the knight. And while knight b5 is interesting, I don't think this is quite correct either. Again, probably because of this a6 move. So, any other ideas? No? All right, well, somebody in the YouTube chat has an interesting idea. They said b4 here. Yeah, so this is a pretty natural move as well. You've drawn this knight to this square, sacrificing a pawn, and then you kick it back immediately, which looks a little strange, but the point is you're gaining a lot of time against this knight. You're opening things up. So this opening line wouldn't be very good if black could come back to d7. If black could come back to d7 and be just fine, then honestly, I don't think this pawn sack makes much sense. But fortunately for white, black can't go back to d7 because of white's next move. Yeah, so bishop b5. This is a playable move, but well, I don't know. It doesn't look very good to me. The reason for that being, this square is kind of important for a different piece, first of all. And second of all, while you do want to be playing on the queen side, you don't really want to be drawing away defenders from your king. And this bishop is actually a very important defender, because the really relevant square in this position is g4. If we give black some time, he'd love to put his knight here, and then push this pawn forward and push g4. This is what black is really playing for, is expanding like this on the king side, bringing this pawn forward, and really pressuring the white king. With that in mind, this bishop does a really nice job of defending this g4 square, stopping black from pushing this quite so early. So any other ideas here? Now is when we want to start making some threats. What do you think? You had it before, Ken. You had it before. We just looked at that, Adi. We just looked at bishop e5. Oh, okay. So we just looked at this. We don't want to bring this bishop away from our king, and it doesn't do a whole lot on b5. But maybe another piece could do something on b5. Maybe. Oh, yeah, the knight. Knight b5. Excellent move. So in this case, knight b5 is actually just winning. And the reason for that is there's no way to defend this pawn. This is why you can't bring the knight back to d7. If the knight isn't here, you would love to play rook f7, simply defending this pawn. But that's simply not possible in this case. So black might make some move, and then the news gets worse for black. After knight takes c7, rook b8, there's simply bishop takes a7, and this rook is stuck. And so black is still going to have some stupid attack on the king's side and probably checkmate you anyways. But white is totally winning here. White is just going to take this rook, bring this knight to this square. Yeah. Yeah, the rook is trapped. We don't even have to take it right away. So this would be winning for white, which is why this line kind of works. After b4, you can't bring this knight back naturally to the king's side. You have to play the unnatural looking knight to a6 to keep this square defended. And this is really the crux of this opening line, of this pawn sacrifice, is black's knight is going to be horribly misplaced, and we're going to say that really slows down your attack, and it gives me enough time to do something on the queen side. So let's take a look at it. How does white continue? White plays knight to d3. Very simple, just defending this b4 square. Pawn, rather. Black plays h5. Again, you're going to see these players really commit to their plans. The knight comes up to b5, threatening to capture on a7. So black responds with b6. And I think this is where Liren started to go wrong. This is something you kind of just have to get a feel for, playing the King's Indian positions a lot. There are some moves that you just have to give your opponent, right? white has such a crushing space advantage on the queen side that black is not going to be able to stop every threat that happens. You're going to have to give something up at some point in the game. And similarly, black has such a crushing space advantage on the king side that white is going to have to give something up on the king side eventually. So it's all a matter of deciding what's important and what's not. In this case, this a pawn wasn't as important as black made it out to be. Playing b6 further weakens this pawn. It kind of weakens this diagonal, and while it shuts off this bishop, it's too much of a waste of time, I think. So in my opinion, this is where Liren started to go wrong. It's not like he's losing or anything, but it doesn't feel quite right, and it's not really in the spirit. Here, white actually plays bishop e1. So what do you think white is trying to do here? It's kind of interesting. Bishop e1 looks pretty unnatural. This is actually a maneuver that's seen in a few lines in the King's Indian. So for one, it makes sense to move this bishop now. Black spent this whole tempo to kind of block off our bishop. So this diagonal isn't the diagonal it used to be. It used to be great. We were attacking a7. After b6, it's not so great. So, Wesley moves his bishop here. It serves a purpose defending his pawn. But more importantly, it's another case of another piece being better on a square. The bishop wasn't actually that great on f2. However, if we were to put a knight on f2, it would serve a very important purpose. Why would we want a knight on f2? What does it do?
G4.
It controls g4, that's right. It's all about this g4 square in this opening line. So the main point of bishop e1 is, yes, it helps defend this pawn, it gets the bishop on a different diagonal, but the main point is it allows this knight to come to f2, where it can slow down black's attack. And black is really going to be missing this knight, we'll see later in the game. If this knight were on f6, then g4 would be so much easier to achieve. Without that knight, it really is going to be tough. Black continues with rook f7. It's a common move, preparing to move this bishop either to f8 or h6, and then bring this rook in behind to support g4. Simply bishop d2, bishop f6, and now knight f2. So white completes this maneuver. In the meantime, black plays queen to e8. Not the most natural looking move, but we'll see, this bishop has kind of taken over this diagonal, so the queen might want to come out along this diagonal. I think this was the basis of black's thinking. It also puts some pressure on this knight. And that's why we see white play queen a4 here, supporting this knight, and, adding more threats to the queen side. Bishop d8, and queen a3. So I want to talk a little bit about this queen maneuver that Wesley did. So it's not entirely unclear why it would be favorable to have the queen on the queen side, attacking, like this pawn, putting pressure on this file, putting pressure on this knight. But what lets white get away with this is the fact that black's knight is so sidelined. You usually don't see this queen leaving the d1 square in this opening line. Usually it's stuck here for the exact reason that we were talking about. It wants to defend against g4. But with this knight so far out of play, unable to come to f6 to support this, white doesn't have to worry so much about it, which is why this line is pretty nice to play for white. You don't have to worry as much about g4. You have some freedom to move your pieces around. With that in mind, so queen a3, also moving the queen from a4 to a3, steps out of this pin and adds some third-rank defense, which is useful once these pawns do get rolling. We see g4. So now this is actually kind of a pawn sacrifice. F takes g, h takes g, and white can't take here thanks to this pressure from the queen. So not a true pawn sacrifice. In this case, white simply plays knight c3 first, removing this knight from danger. The knight takes on b4, and the queen takes on b4. So now, rather than kind of play black's position, Liren decided he was going to sacrifice this knight in order to get his plan through. But already, I think this kind of shows why b6 might have not been the best move. And so, what do I mean by that? I mean, black spends a tempo here to save this pawn. He spends one tempo to save this pawn. And then later on down the line, he gives up a full knight for one tempo. Does that kind of make sense? So he's spending the tempo that he saved, by the tempo that he lost by playing b6, he's exchanging that for a knight, which doesn't make the most sense to me. I would rather give up this a7 pawn than my knight. With that in mind, black can't play something like knight b8 here, because then we would actually just capture this pawn. And if black loses the g4 pawn, he loses a lot of his attacking potential. So this was the decision that Liren had to make here. He could try to play normally and move his rook to g7, move this knight to h4, try to play g4, but he decided that simply wasn't going to work in this case because this knight is so far sidelined. So you can kind of see how this line really puts black into a tough spot. Black has to make these really tough decisions where if he just carries on business as usual, it's not really going to work out for him. You really need this knight for this plan to kind of work. So you have to get kind of creative and do things like sacrifice. However, this is not altogether terrible for black. This is still a very interesting game. And so let's see what Wesley did to finish it off. Not that we're anywhere near that yet. So black gets to play f3. Once again, you see the importance of this g-pawn. It supports pawn breaks like this to rip open the king. Bishop b5, queen e7, and g3. So white wants to keep the king side locked at all costs. It'd be a huge mistake to do something like pawn takes pawn here. I can't even decide whether I would do this or something like knight h4. But you have to keep your king as defended as you can. So we see g3. This rook comes to h7. White simply plays queen to c4. Once again, not worrying too much about what black's doing because he has another very interesting, very useful move to really lock down the king side, which we'll see in a second. The rook comes to h8. The queen comes to c6. So he's invading with his pieces on the queen side. Queen to h7. And now this might be the move of the game to take away. The move of the game. Who can find the move of the game? And really, Wesley found it like 5 moves ago when he realized he could ignore this. Here you can kind of find it by elimination. Almost all your moves get checkmated, so find the ones that don't. That's my advice to you. So okay, you can give this check, but actually black's just going to move out of the way. Now your queen's attacked, and you're getting checkmated. That's rough. That's rough. Knight takes g4. So this does defend checkmate, but it does sacrifice your knight back. And I'm not sure what's going on here. I think I would rather be black because I would be afraid with white. But yeah, white doesn't need to give up this knight, actually. The YouTube chat is torn. Hi. Welcome. So what can white do to prevent mate? I'll let you guys come up with 1 or 2 more ideas. H4, so that's a really good idea. And you're on the side of most of the YouTube viewers. However, the YouTube viewers are mostly wrong. So what's the problem with H4? What do you think? Yeah, if you put this pawn somewhere black can take it, black is just gonna, I don't know how he's gonna take it, but he's gonna take it, probably with the knight. And he's gonna come crashing through. And then you have all the same problems with 0 pawns in front of your king now. Because of that, Wesley played the better way to block off this file with h3. So I do want to mention congratulations to Pantakel. the only player in the YouTube chat to give h3.
I tossed that out immediately.
Yeah, so it looks pretty unnatural, right? You're putting this pawn on a square where it can just be captured. But what do you think the idea is? What does white do after black takes this pawn?
He doesn't recapture it.
Exactly. In fact, he has to do something pretty immediately, otherwise it's still bad. Yeah, Ducha?
King on h2.
King on h2. That's right. So king h2, and this is a stellar defensive setup for white. This is something you might have seen before in other positions, where you use your opponent's pawn to really blockade in your king. It's, you know, white's best defender is the pawn on h3. I think that's fair to say. Yeah, so this pawn keeps out this bishop, this queen, and this rook. So if black could take off this pawn, he would win immediately, but fortunately, that's not allowed in chess. So this is a very, very interesting idea that Wesley came up with here in the game. And I think it's one that can be used in different types of positions in the King's Indian. It's a very useful one to remember. You always want to be looking for these creative ways to really block down or at least slow down your opponent's attack.
Yeah, and I rejected h3 because I'm automatically taking with the knight.
Yeah, that's right. So
Boris says it all the time. You don't have to recapture.
captures aren't forced, that's right. So h3, a stellar move. And it's really more impressive because as soon as Wesley played g3, I think he already knew what he was going to do with this h3 move. Because the most obvious plan for black is, of course, this idea where you just double on the h file and give checkmate. And so not only does Wesley see that there, but you can tell he sees it here because he just ignores everything black is doing until the last moment. He just gets his queen in nonchalantly, ignoring queen h7, and then hits him with h3. So yeah, this move I think is the move of the game.
That is awesome.
So black doesn't actually take here because that would really shut down the file for good. He wants to keep options open. Someday he wants to take this pawn with some other piece, but not a pawn. So he plays rook b8, saving his rook. Knight back to d1. So now we see kind of a re-maneuvering of white, which Wesley does very skillfully here. But the nice thing about the King's Indian is if you really slow down black's attack on the king's side, you winning on the queen's side is almost inevitable. Meaning you just have way too much space, your pieces are way too strong. You should always be able to find some way to kind of knock down the front door. But of course, if you're playing Ding Liren, you have to play accurately too. So a6 is played. White actually goes for queen e8 here, which is a little strange considering we said after king g7, this queen looks almost trapped. But here's what makes this game really special is Wesley takes on d8. So what's going on here? Well, it's exactly what it seems. White is losing his queen. Rook takes d8, rook takes c7, bishop takes, or bishop d7, rook takes, and bishop takes. And at the end of the day, let's count the pieces. One knight to one knight, one rook to one rook, one queen for two bishops and a knight, and black is up a pawn. So white has these three pieces for this queen, and this is what really seals the deal for this game, makes it a special one, is white just proceeds to completely outplay the queen almost immediately.
And of the three pieces, two of them are bishops. So
Yeah.
it's just dominating.
Yeah, the bishop pair killing the queen. Okay, so black finally says, all right, fine. I'll take your stupid pawn. White plays king h2, definitely not capturing this pawn, even if it is free. Rook b7, the bishop just comes to e6. Knight f8, bishop f5, queen h5, knight g4. And the end is nearing here, actually. So knight d7. So at this point, black is actually still kind of in the game. He's definitely worse. But if he can find some way to maybe sacrifice this rook for one of the minor pieces to open things up for his pawns, he has some kind of chances, I think. But I don't know. This is a very, very difficult position to play with black against all these pieces. So knight d7, but this runs into bishop h6 check, forcing the king back to h8. Now the second knight enters the game. Rook c7, but the counterplay isn't enough. After bishop takes, rook takes, rook f5, And now we see the clear end game of the three pieces against the queen. Yeah. So we see actually some very weird looking coordination between all these pieces. This knight kind of centrally holding everything down, and this knight for backup, and this pawn as well, and this bishop. I honestly, I don't think I've seen many things like this in chess, but it's super interesting. And it's, in fact, I think just winning for white. Queen f7, bishop g5, b5, knight h6. So we see, once again, Wesley So, he's so good at chess. He really just masterfully uses the pieces here to get this pawn down the board. It's important to notice queen g5 isn't doing anything. You might think it's attacking this bishop, and if this bishop moves, I'll take your knight. But in reality, I can just play f6 here, taking advantage of this unfortunate placement of your pieces. So yeah, once again, Wesley has it all under control. Queen f8, f6, king h7, knight f5, king g6, bishop h4, e4, f7, e3, bishop e7, e2, and now we simply check, take the queen. Black gets a new one, but it's not enough. More technique, and then here Black actually resigned, and Wesley So won the game. So this is a super crazy game. This is one of my favorite games of chess, actually, because, you know, Wesley really outplayed Ding Liren in every stage of the game.
Who was it against?
So yeah, Wesley was playing against Ding Liren.
Oh, Ding Liren.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. There was no slouch.
Yeah, definitely no slouch. Now, you know, solidly the number 3 player in the world, over 2,800, Ding Liren. A true superstar of chess, but he kind of got demolished this game. He kind of got demolished. Any questions about this game? There was a lot to kind of cover there. I'll go back over the key points in a second. No? All right. That's fair. I still have questions about this game, and I'll never stop having questions, but that's fine. The main points, Black is playing for the dark squares in the center, which is what forces White to go for this kind of setup. We see the knight come back to e1. This is in an effort to prevent this knight from kind of advancing and allow this f-pawn some mobility. And bishop e3, and f5, f3, f4, bishop f2. So now we see the dynamic. White points his pieces at the queen's side, Black points his pieces at the king's side, and we're going to see some kind of race for checkmate or to win on the queen's side. The key start of the line is after c5, gambiting a pawn. Black will play knight takes. D takes is not so good because we get something similar to what happened in knight takes, bishop takes, but I get to keep my bishop this time, right? So it's a lot better. So knight takes, b4 is the main point, and now knight d7 is not possible due to knight b5, which is why we see knight a6. And the dynamic of the game from here on out is White says your plan with g4 is going to be way too slow because you've been forced to sideline your knight to a6. And meanwhile, Black is going to say, I think I can get g4 in anyway, and my knight on a6 is kind of keeping your pieces out of the game. Just to fast forward, we saw b6, which I don't think is the best idea for Black. It kind of wastes the tempo at a critical moment. We see this maneuver with the knight coming to f2, supporting g4. We see this queen coming to a3, putting pressure on the weak knight. And then we see Black eventually caving in, playing g4 anyways, with the idea of playing a piece sacrifice. And last but not least, the move of the game, h3, keeping Black's pieces out of the game. And then the rest was just Wesley So being Wesley So. I'm not going to tell you to try to emulate this, because I don't think many people in the world could, with these amazing queen sacrifices and piece maneuvering and coordination. That's just Wesley So being Wesley So. So again, the main points, the c5 pawn sacrifice is to sideline the knight. White attacks on the queen side, Black attacks on the king's side, and whoever gets there first is kind of the winner. All right, let's take a look at a little bit more of a tamer line now. I think we might not have time to get to the third line, which is fine. So once again, we're going to look at all the same opening moves, the basic King's Indian moves. But here, instead of playing e5, let's look at what happens if Black plays knight a6. So once again, the idea is you want to attack this c5 square, and in some lines you want to come to b4. We see white continue naturally just by castling, and e5. And now white actually has a lot of options here. You can play d5. I don't think it's the best. Bishop e3 is a very common move. And then the move I'm going to recommend is rook e1, simply bringing the rook to the file to help control the center. Rook e1 was played in this game. And sorry, I forgot to mention, this is Daniel Fridman against Gadir Guseinov with the black pieces. So rook e1. This bishop comes to g4 in this game. And this is actually a line that my friend plays. And, okay. Little bug in Lichess here, but that's fine. Okay, so bishop g4. So this really highlights the dark square method for black. So black is saying, I will control the dark squares by any means necessary, including giving up this important bishop on the light squares for this knight, which controls these dark squares. And this is an idea that you see in a few lines in the King's Indian. With that in mind, white plays bishop to e3. This move is even better now because black can't chase it away with this knight on g4 ever. We see bishop takes or we don't. Sometimes we see bishop takes f3. We see that later in this game. Rook e8 first, d5, knight c5, and now we see h3, and bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3. So how do you think this game differs from the first game that we looked at? How is this line different?
There's no pawn storm yet for black.
Yeah, there's no pawn storm yet for black. So black's kind of saying, I'm not gonna rush things with this just yet. What's different from the white point of view? Besides, missing the knight.
This queen's not as active.
Yeah, okay, so we left the queen back here in this game. I think a lot of the main differences are we push this pawn forward, and this is kind of committal. We saw in the last games, black is playing g4 to play against the f3 pawn. Here, now h3 is also kind of going to be a hook. In addition to that, black has put this knight on c5. This is something we didn't really see in the last game until we made black put his knight on c5. And so the difference here is black is really going to play to keep this knight solidified on c5. He plays a5 to stop b4 from kicking his knight away. So in this line, black takes a more defensive kind of approach. That's what I would call it, at least. Defensive meaning he's playing against white's plan on the queen's side more than he is just ignoring it and trying to checkmate on the king's side. He's playing moves like a5 and knight c5, kind of blockading the queen's side while still pressuring the center. So black's play is different because it's more based around the center and preventing white's plan rather than solely just going for checkmate. Meanwhile, from the white side, his plan is going to largely be the same. He still wants to play on the queen's side. It's just going to have to happen a little bit differently because black is really trying to stop it. Here, white simply plays queen c2, defending the e4 pawn. Knight f d7 is played. And now b3 is played. What do you guys think about this move? This might strike you as a little strange.
Yeah, because of knight to b6.
Okay, you think it's playing against something like knight b6, defending this pawn? Any other reasons why b3 might have been played? It's a little paradoxical. What if I told you he played b3 because he wants to play b4? Would that make sense?
Say that again.
He played b3 because he wants to play b4.
We're
supposed to ask, well, why didn't you just play b4?
So, okay. You obviously can't just play b4 here immediately. Black's going to take it. That was the whole point of this a5 move. So what's the most natural way to try to get b4 in? What's the most natural way to support it?
Rook.
So, sure, you can use the rook, but we'd really love to take back with the pawn here to kick this knight away,
Oh, okay,
right?
so just a3.
The point of b4 is to kick this knight away. It's not so, it is to open lines, but the main point is getting rid of this annoying knight. So white would love to play a3, But then if we follow down this thinking process, there's this annoying rule in chess called en passant. And after a4, we can never take back on b4 with the pawn, because black actually takes on b3. And so if we were to play a3, a4 would really lock down the queen side for black. This would really put a huge stop to white's queenside pawn storms. So the solution to this is to play b3, because you want to play b4. Black plays some move, and now when you play a3, you have more options after a4. One of them being b4, of course. In the game, we saw a4, and in this case, black actually is playing this as a pawn sacrifice, allowing us to take this pawn, and if we count the defenders and attackers, we're clear. And with that in mind, b4 still would have been an option for white, and this is how a lot of games go, is white ends up playing this b4 move here. But the difference here is that black sacrificed a pawn, and white decided he wanted a pawn. Of course, let's take a look at what happens if black ignores us on the queen side and plays an annoying move like f4. What do you guys think about this move here? What would you do? Would you retreat the bishop or take on c5? Or find some mysterious tactic that I don't see? You would retreat the bishop? So that's, yeah, that would be fine. I agree. I think here the reason why black didn't play this is because he was worried about the time. He wanted to play a4 to really force white's hand on the queen side. Now, if white were to play b4, maybe this knight can come into b3 and use this as a home. There's some kind of sacrifice to always worry about, but maybe if this knight can land on d4, black's going to be happy. So I think that's why he played a4. On the other hand, if we play f4, and white uses this time to force black's hands into gaining a tempo by capturing here, now if we play b4, this knight doesn't have this extra option. I think this is what black was worried about in the game. I don't know if this is entirely unplayable for black. I think this is something he could have tried, but white's plans would really be accelerated if he were allowed to do something like this. Once again, this bishop on e3 is very important, so it takes a lot to give it up, but I think this is a case where it would be worth it. But okay, in the game we saw a4, and knight takes a4, knight a4, pawn a4. Pawn takes on e4 was played. Here, I don't think it makes as much sense to play f4 anymore. The reason for that being, you're really locking this bishop out of the game, kind of for all of eternity. So black takes on e4 with the idea that maybe someday this pawn will move out of the way and this bishop can breathe, or maybe someday the bishop will come to this diagonal if this bishop gets diverted. From here we saw b6, trying again to play for the dark squares. Rook a b1, rook a7, bishop d2, queen e7, rook b5. So once again, white is really playing on the queen side here, and I think already white is much, much better. The reason for that being, black obviously didn't go as hard on the king's side this game, right? He didn't try as hard to go for these checkmates, and as such, his play over here has kind of completely stalled. Black is really playing white's game on the queen's side. He's really, putting all of his marbles on this knight being really good on c5, but it's just not enough to make up for, the deficiencies in his position, the lack of space, the pawn breaks that white has. They really are what decide this game. We see bishop f6, and now a5 is, of course, the great pawn break. The bishop comes to g5, so at this point, black is working really hard to fix his horrible pieces, but in the meantime, white is making a lot of progress on the queen side. Bishop comes to b4, king comes to g7, pawn number 2 rolls up the board, Rook e a8, takes on b6, takes on b6, simply rook a1. And you can see that white is really giving up nothing, and he's still up a pawn, and he's still going to have plenty of ideas on this queen side. Queen f8, queen d1, bishop d8, rook a3, knight c5, rook f3. And then, black's whole point of this opening was to have a really good knight on c5, and so white simply captures it. We see bishop c2, bishop a5, simply g3. And a little on down the road, at the end of the day, white is simply up a pawn, and black doesn't have much to show for it. So we get to this endgame, in which a lot of moves are played, which I'm going through very quickly. And now white is up 2 pawns and manages to convert this somehow, some way. Black just resigns here. This bishop is not enough to cover both of these pawns on files so far away. This final position is actually zugzwang, by the way. The black king has to move away, or the black bishop has to move away either from f6 or from a5. And so this is just winning for white. I scrolled through the last part of that game pretty darn quickly there, but any questions about this game? What went wrong for black? What went well for white? What do you think? Nothing? Yeah?
He didn't get any kingside play.
He didn't get any kingside play. I think that's a lot of what went wrong. He kind of half-heartedly played, well, I don't know if he played it half-heartedly. Maybe he played it with a lot of authority, but he played f5, and then this didn't really develop into anything. He spent a lot of time trying to stop white's play on the queen side, but once again, if you spend too much time on the side where your opponent is strong, your opponent will always be able to break through. You want to be playing on the side where you're strong, more often than not. So I think, yeah, what went wrong was this a4 pawn sacrifice didn't really get the job done. It didn't really do it for me. As well as some of this maneuvering, I just think it wasn't the best for black. So, okay. So yeah, black didn't get enough play on the king side, I think is the short way to describe it. So in the remaining time, I'm going to see if I can get through this third game between the one and only Boris Gelfand and Vassily Ivanchuk. So this was the last kind of way to play that I wanted to look at. And it's with knight b to d7 rather than this knight to c6. So this is kind of the starting position I wanted to look at. So what do you think the differences are here with this knight on d7 rather than being on c6? What do you think?
Well, the d5 push doesn't.
Yeah, one difference for white is that when you push d5, you're not attacking anything. So it's a lot less appealing. But the counterpart to this is that with the knight on c6, black is forcing you to push d5 because he's putting so much pressure on this d pawn. So because in this game, black didn't put so much pressure on d4, we don't have to move it right away. And in fact, we don't want to, which is why white actually plays bishop e3 here. So there should be like one move that really sticks out to you whenever you see bishop e3 played in positions like this. Do you guys know what move that is?
You don't mean knight to g4.
Yeah, knight g4 should stick out. White added a defender to d4, but it can't really stay there because knight g4 attacks this bishop and makes it move. In this case, this is a fine opening line for black, but this is just another way to play. I think this bishop comes to g5, this pawn comes to f6, bishop comes back to d2, and then maybe this knight is a little bit misplaced. But okay, in this game, black didn't want to play like that, so black just plays c6. And now that black has made kind of some hook for us to latch onto, white actually plays d5. Because in this case, white now has options whenever he wants to try to open this d file and attack this d pawn. Black decided he didn't like that, so he played c5. And now we kind of reach the main structure of this game. we see c4, d5, e4 against d6, c5, e5. Is this something you guys are kind of familiar with? Something you've seen? Yeah, so what do you think the differences are here compared to those first games we looked at? What's different about this structure? Do you think this structure is better for black than the last structure or worse for black than the last structure?
Because the c file is closed.
Yeah, I agree. I think this structure is a lot more solid for black. Altogether, you're preventing this c5 break. This is really huge for black. White can still find play on the queen side by doing something like b4 and taking here, but it's going to be a lot less threatening than when white was going to play c5. So what has black given up for this favorable change in structure? What did black have to give up? Well, yeah, what do you mean by that? He gave up some other kind of advantage for this structural advantage.
Space.
Well, no, he actually, space is one way to phrase it, but I think he might have less space with this pawn on c7, right?
Right.
The structure is favorable because he has more space.
Yeah.
He gave up space in the sense that this knight couldn't come to c6 first, but in the end that knight came back to e7. Maybe he's giving up space because this knight would like to go to d7, but now it can't. So in a sense, some space, but that's not the huge thing. So the huge thing that he gave up is time. He played c6 and then c5, as well as developing this knight to a suboptimal square, meaning he's going to have to, shuffle his pieces around a little bit to get his plan going. So he gave up a lot of time in this position. So that's what white really wants to play for here. He wants to use his advantage in time to get something immediate, some immediate advantage back. And let's see what white did in this game. Here he played knight e1, the same maneuver that we talked about. So first off, he's preventing this knight from advancing, forcing it to go back to maybe a suboptimal square on e8. Like we said, this knight would like to go to d7 maybe, but his friend is in the way. So knight e8, and now, this is, I think, the main move for this opening. This is what really showed Boris's understanding here. Let's show an example line first to maybe help you find it. So if we do nothing, if we play rook b1 trying to play b4, black is going to play f5. If we play our normal f3 and f4, bishop f2, g5, we've seen this type of stuff before, right? This looks very, very familiar. But the difference here, of course, is that we don't ever have this option. This option is just not available to us. We can play things like b4 and take on c5, but in the end, this really isn't enough. This isn't enough to warrant, playing this. This isn't enough advantage on the queen side to warrant the attack on the king side that black is going to get, is what I'm saying. You need more than this. So white came up with something to do besides trying to play on the queen side. And he's allowed to do this thanks to his advantage in time. Hey, Michael.
White's move?
Yeah, white to move and prevent black's plan.
I still want to play f4.
So f4 shouldn't be your first instincts. You want some kind of Benoni structure, I guess, where you can get at this guy. But the thing is, you're really improving black's bishop when you play this f4 move. This isn't something you want to really be doing.
Does it move his knight to b4 to attack that pawn on d6?
So yeah, you can make some threats, but the one good thing about this knight is it does defend d6, and really you're just going to get kicked away.
Wasting time.
And this is going to come anyways. Yeah, Michael? G3. So what about G3 prevents this plan? You want to play f4 here? So this is something that we looked at, and this is something you can consider. to get this play against d6. But once again, you're really opening up black's bishop here. In some positions, this is the way to play for white, but I don't think this placement of pieces really is the best option. Black's ready to hop into e5. He's ready to use this bishop. He's ready to bring this bishop out to this f5 square eventually. But yeah, g3 is interesting. It's a lot like f4.
So black's plan is centered around f5.
Yeah.
And if we can prevent it at all costs, then we should be better, right? So why not g4?
Exactly. That's what was played in the game. So g4, shutting down black's plan. And once again, this is an idea that you see from time to time in the King's Indian, but really it's good when black has wasted some time. Black has wasted some time by playing c6 and c5, so now white is going to take advantage of that by playing g4. Queen h4.
The pawn's in front of your king.
Yeah, I know, but it's worth it. It's worth it in this case. So, okay, queen h4. White moves his king. Yeah, not too much more to say. That's what happens. King h8, rook g1, queen back to e7. White was threatening to go to g5, trapping the queen. a3, knight f6, b4. So now we kind of see white has prevented f5, and so now he goes about his plans on the queen side at his leisure. So black got this favorable change in structure, but white got this favorable change in structure, and so it's kind of a battle of who got the better deal from the exchange of time. Black plays b6, white plays knight d3, once again slowly bringing his pieces to the queen side. Knight back to g8, a4, advancing, and now black finally decides to break through with f5. So in this case, white went for g5, which is a really interesting way to try to keep things closed. It really highlights the problem with black's pieces. They really would like this f6 square and this h6 square, and g5 takes away both of those. The queen comes to f7, a5. So once again, white commits some moves on the king's side in this case, but in the end, it all comes back to the queen's side. That's where he's really making his advantages. Trying to win the game. Rook b8, and we see f3, defending this pawn, giving this bishop some space. h6, trying to break out. A takes b, h4, not allowing black to have control of this square. f4, bishop f2, h takes g, and black gives up and plays bishop f6. From this point earlier, I would say white was definitely much better, but bishop f6 is just, it's too much. You can't give up the piece like this. This is what really lost the game. Well, okay, but white doesn't take it. He just plays rook g2. Yeah, so the bishop comes back to d8, but once again, the knights can't use this square. The knight comes to b5, knight e7, rook h2 check, king g8, bishop f1. And I mean, like, okay. You know what I mean? Obviously, this is not what black wanted. So I think white definitely has a winning position here. I'll flip through the rest of the moves, but before we continue, does it make sense how white kind of got a winning advantage here? I flipped through this game like super quickly and didn't explain a whole lot of it, but the key point is this g4 idea. g4 really locking down on this f5 square, making it a lot harder for black to achieve his plans. This is how white chose to use his advantage in time. And then later on, g5 is just some nice understanding. This isn't entirely related to the opening, but your opponent really needs these squares, so white took them away, and that's what slowed down black's plan further.
That's why it's good to know the ideas behind opening, so you do g4.
Exactly. You have to understand when black goes for something like this, he's giving up his time in exchange, and so you have to use that time in an effort to do something concrete. So knight e7, rook h2, king g8, bishop f1, queen g7, knight up to a7. So white's really having his way with black here, just putting his knights wherever he wants. Bishop d7, b takes c. And here we see a pawn sacrifice. And black's pieces are just too bad to be able to play against these pawns. Knight c8, takes, bishop h3. And here, black resigns. Because he's checkmated, and these pawns are queening, and this rook's coming in, and this bishop's good, and these pieces are bad. I think that was enough reasons to resign. But yeah, mainly he's checkmated after check, check, check. So in closing, do you guys feel like you learned some stuff about the King's Indian? What do you think was unclear this lecture? Anything? Any extra questions you have? Anything you've run into against the King's Indian that you were worried about?
I switched to E4, which wasn't easy.
Switch to E4? Because of the King's Indian. Well, now you can switch back with confidence.
Yeah, he wants me to stay on E4, so that's fine.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay, so in closing, the main idea of this classical line here is the c5 pawn sacrifice, sidelining black's knight. And this is, of course, after the main line with knight c6. So you want to sideline black's knight and then play on the queen side. In this game, black plays for a more, I would say, defensive setup, where he doesn't go all out on the king side right away and tries to solidify a knight on c5. Once again, you want to play on the queen side, making sure to not allow this structural disadvantage with a3 and a4. And lastly, in this line, where black wastes some time by playing c6 and then c5, you want to use that extra time to do something concrete to slow down black's plan. In this case, it was g4. In other cases, it might be something else. You'll have to find it on your own sometimes in chess.
You do G4 immediately in this position?
So you have to move the knight first to defend it.
I just realized that.
Mm-hmm.
And then,
Yep. Well, thank you all very much for coming out tonight. That'll be it from me. And join me next week on the road to 2000s.